We'll have a theoretical talk for you today. The seminar will be given by Dr. Benedetta Flebus from UT Austin. Dr. Flebus earned her bachelor's degree at the University of Trieste, 2 master's degrees from UPMC in Paris and EPFL in Lausanne, and a PhD degree from Utrecht University. She held a postdoctoral position at UCLA and is now completing a second appointment at UT Austin. And in the fall, she'll be joining the faculty at Boston College. The title of the talk today is Unveiling New Phenomena in Magnetic Systems, and Dr. Flebus will take it over from here.
Okay, thanks a lot for the introduction. And let's say I never thought I would be giving a talk from my bedroom, but let's try to do this. So today I want to discuss some new prospects and ideas that I have, in the context of magnetic systems. But especially I want to show you a first result, or what I believe is a first step in this direction. So I will show you some results of a new project that I've been working on with Hilary Hurst and also with Rembert Downe, which was my PhD supervisor. So in general, I think my talk, and also somehow this project is driven by what was my research path. I've been working in Spintronics during all my PhD. And then more recently, I started looking at electronic systems and also electronic driven systems. So in this context, you see that there are definitely 3 ideas, one that is not so new and 2 that are really more recent, that are really revolutionizing the understanding that we have of electronic systems. And one is definitely topology. And more recently, people have been really interested in trying to understand the role of drives to drive systems into phases that have, for example, different topological properties or in general different properties. And even more recently, there's been a lot of interest in the context of twistronics, meaning the idea of creating new phases in a material by stacking and twisting 2D materials together. So my interest is really trying to understand how can we extend these concepts within the context of spintronics. But before I get to that, let me just say a few words more about these 3 concepts. So probably you're familiar with topology. So this is really broadly the application of topological ideas to both real space and a reciprocal space structure in condensed matter. And in general, the ideas of topology has led us to discover a plethora of new phenomena and materials. So it's definitely really important to understand how to describe correctly the topology of the systems that we are looking at. And in general, this idea has been ubiquitous in the context of electronic systems since the quantum Hall effect was discovered. But now people are really shifting towards new directions, and they are starting looking, for example, at bosonic dissipative systems such as photonic system. Anyways, no matter which type of system we are looking at or the topological classification that we are focusing on, there is a concept that is tangential and always manifest within topology and its application to condensed matter, which is the idea of a bulk edge correspondence. So the idea that between a topologically trivial and non-trivial material, we can find topologically protected edge states. And today I will show you an example of this in the context of magnetic systems. Something else that I've been interested in and I've been working on is what is called broadly Floquet Engineering. So this is the idea of trying to manipulate the quantum system by using periodic drives. And we try to use periodic drives because thanks to the periodicity of the drive, it turns out that we can still describe a system by using a band structure type of picture. So if a system is driven by a periodic drive, we can still describe it via band structure. Of course, the bands that we have now are not only the initial physical bands that we started with. We will also have this so-called Floquet bands that corresponds to the absorption of 1 or more photons or the emission of them from the system. And this was mostly a theoretical proposal until it was effectively measured in a really beautiful experiment. This was done in the group of New Gedic, where they started shining light on the surface of a topological insulator, and they observed the emergence of these Floquet block states. So as you can see here, the emergence of these bands, which reflect the system upon the absorption of a certain number of photons. So after that, there was a lot of interest in this type of techniques. And people started thinking about using these drives to realize the synthetic gauge fields. So to use this drive to change the topology of otherwise topologically trivial systems. And I think this is a very interesting idea also in the context of magnetic system, but again, it really requires us to properly understand their topology. And then something else that I've been working on recently is what is called broadly twistronics. So this is a really new field that has already attracted a lot of attention, and it all really started when people observed flat bands and especially a rich phase diagram in bilayer graphene twisted at a magic angle. So the idea that we take two layers of graphene, we just oppose them and we twist them, and as already Biziser and McDonald observed almost a decade ago at this time, electrons at a certain magic angle will experience flat bands around the Fermi level. And what was even more interesting is that at this magic angle, it was experimentally observed that the twisted bilayer graphene displays a rich phase diagram that it's impossible to find in pristine layer graphene. And it's really much more remnant of superconducting, unconventional superconducting system. So while I would say that most of the community now is really trying to understand what's going on in this system, I think we should not forget the fact that this is a general concept. The idea that we can create new phases by stacking and twisting 2D layered system. So we had the proposal for realizing this in one dimension. And more recently, in the group of Leon Ballen, they started looking at the possibility of creating new phases in magnetic system by stacking and twisting 2D van der Waals materials. So in general, as I try to really explain you very briefly, this type of concepts have led to the observation of new phenomena in electronic system. So my broad question is, can we do the same when we start looking at magnetic systems and especially magnetic insulating systems? And I think the first thing that we could do in order to answer this question is try to understand why this hasn't really been done organically already. So is there because there is not enough overlap between the different communities, or is there a more intrinsic issue in starting exploring magnetic materials using this theoretical truss? So I believe, and I will try to explain you today, that there is definitely a more intrinsic issue. And this issue is really associated with how we discuss topology in magnetic systems. And this will definitely relate to the dissipation that we encounter in magnetic systems. But I will also try to have an optimistic perspective and show you that now there are new theoretical tools that can allow us to overcome this issue. So let me clarify what I'm really referring to when I'm talking about topology in magnetic systems. So usually when we discuss topology in magnetic system, we do it mostly in trying to apply topological concepts to real space spin texture. So we are quite familiar with the discussion of topology in the context of magnetic defects. For example, domain wall or skyrmions or edge-offs. So we have really applied topology to the spin texture in real space that is associated with these defects. But the type of topology that I will discuss today, it's a different one. It actually takes place maybe more traditionally in reciprocal space. And it's the topology that is associated with magnons. So I believe that probably all of you know what magnons are, but just as a reminder, magnons are the second quantized operator that we associate to the density of spin fluctuations that we find in a system. So they're really the elementary spin excitation. And when we start thinking about the spin-spin coupling that is present in a material, we can also undistinguishably discuss them as spin waves. So why there is an issue with the topology of magnetic system and especially the elementary magnetic excitations? So this issue really stems from the fact that in magnetic system, spin non-conserving interactions are always present. So in other words, magnons, differently from electrons, are of course not particles, they are quasi-particles. Therefore, the free energy of a system wants to minimize itself, and it will do it by damping magnons. So magnons will have different channels through which they can dissipate in different materials. So in the most general case, this could happen because of an interaction with electrons and phonons. And even if we manage to eliminate the interaction with the electrons, still we all know that in magnetic insulating systems, magnon-phonon interactions are always definitely present. And they have been measured many times, even every time we perform a ferromagnetic resonance experiment. And we also observed them recently as a very pronounced signature in a spin transport experiment. So they are there. Now the question is, how are we going to describe these interactions, first of all? So definitely, if we want to do a very accurate job, we are going to always take in account what is the type of spin ordering that we have in a structure, and what is also the crystalline structure that we are observing. So a really microscopic derivation of magnon-phonon interaction will be really very much sample and material specific. But for today, let me focus on the simplest way that we have to capture this type of interaction. So let me focus on the very simple LLG type of picture. I'm thinking about a spin or a magnetic moment, and I'm looking at its dynamics. So we all know that we can write its dynamics as function of the Landau-Lifshitz-Gilbert equation. And then there will be this parameter, which is a Gilbert damping, that accounts for the dissipation that the magnetization is intrinsically subjected to in every material. So now, if I look at this equation, which is a semi-classical equation, and I perform an Austen-Primakov transformation, this is what is going to happen. So if I'm focusing now just on the term that is associated with the Gilbert damping, the type of term that I'm going to obtain comes out as this. So you usually do not see this type of terms in the Hamiltonians that are discussed in literature. And this occurs because we did not really know until recently, or at least for me was not really broad knowledge, how to treat Hamiltonian that are non-Hermitian. But from a topological point of view, every time we try to topologically classify a system, we are dealing with an Hamiltonian description. So when we are dealing with this Hamiltonian description in the context of electronic systems, we are looking at systems in which the number of electrons, for example, is conserved. So we know quite a lot about topology, but we know about Hermitian type of topology. And if we want to be really, let me say, honest or accurate in the description of magnetic system, we cannot really neglect the fact that inside dissipation is there and is going to introduce a term that is non-Hermitian. So what can we do about it? We could, let's say, neglect this term. And there have been quite some proposals of topological magnons in literature that neglect this term and exploit, for example, the inhomogeneity of dipolar interaction, the presence of DMI or drives, in order to propose topological magnons. And this is one of, let's say, the nicest one of my favorite one that was from Murakami and his group. But the issue here is that, again, we are dealing with Hermitian Hamiltonians, and we know that our system is non-Hermitian. So the point being, if we don't really account properly for dissipation, can we actually predict theoretically something that is accurate enough to guide experiments and observe some topological magnetic states? So we decided, together with Hilary and Rambert, to try to take a different route, and instead just account for the dissipation in magnetic system and understand if we could realize a topological magnetic phase in which dissipation is accounted for. And what came to our help are some very recent developments in the context of topology in non-Hermitian physics. So there have been many works, especially in the last 2 years. And I think this one is probably one of the nicest reviews in which they derive a topological classification for non-Hermitian systems. Now, in this paper that is purely theoretical, they do predict the existence of topological states in Hamiltonians that are non-Hermitian. Now, most likely some of you might have some skepticism, because at the end this is a theoretical proposal, but what is really nice about all this topic is that this type of states have been already observed in the context of photonics. So by realizing some systems that were based on microresonators, people have been able to observe topologically protected edge states in dissipative systems, as photonic systems, of course, are. So these topological states, by the way, they will be quite different from the ones that we are used to. And I will show you in our example of a magnetic non-Hermitian topological phase where the difference comes from. So let me show you our proposal for a non-Hermitian topological magnetic systems. So this proposal, it's based on spin torque oscillators. So well, I don't know all the audience, but I guess most of you know how this system works. So briefly, this is a tri-layer in which you will have a fixed layer and a free layer that is separated by a spacer, usually a dielectric, but not necessarily one. And when I'm saying fixed or free, I refer to the magnetization. So in the fixed layer, the magnetization direction is assumed to be fixed, maybe because the layer is thick enough or the anisotropies are strong enough for it to be fixed despite the external stimuli. But instead, for the free layer, there will be the magnetization will be free to process. And generally, these systems have been already exploited and proposed for a variety of applications. So let me just show you briefly how this works. Usually, you inject a charge current in the system, and this current becomes spin polarized when it passes through the fixed layer. And then we will have a spin torque that is exerted on the magnetization of the free layer. Now, if the spin torque is strong enough, it will trigger magnetization dynamics. And then ultimately, we can also measure this, for example, via a magnetoresistant type of measurement. But what I'm going to focus on is really the magnetization dynamics of this free layer. So let me show you how I'm going to write the equation of motion, now using still LLG type of phenomenology. So I will have to account for an FMR frequency, which is fixed by mostly the magnetic field and the demagnetization, the intrinsic demagnetization of the sample. Then there will be some Gilbert damping, so some dissipation that is accounted for. But in this case, I'm also injecting a spin current. So a spin torque is acting on the magnetization. So I will focus on the linear regime. We're just going to look at small fluctuations with respect to the equilibrium position of the magnetization. And then I will also perform an Austin-Primakov transformation, because ultimately I'm really interested in recasting an Hamiltonian description of this system. So now for an isolated spin torque oscillator that obeys this equation, the Hamiltonian can be written as follows. So there is obviously an Hermitian part, just the FMR frequency of this oscillator, but then there is also an Hermitian part, which now consists of two terms. We have the term that is proportional to alpha, which expresses damping of the magnetization. And then we have a term that is proportional to the current that we inject in the sample. And what is really interesting and very convenient about this type of system, and that's why we chose them for this first proposal, is that the gain and loss and their ratio can be really tuned experimentally by using a spin current. So now let me start building up on this, hopefully thinking that this could be experimentally realizable. And let me think about creating an array of such a spin torque oscillators, possibly just by having some metallic spacer between two of them, or even by depositing all of them on some platinum film. And now you see that I'm artificially labeling one spin torque oscillator as A and the other one as B. And there are two metallic spacers, and maybe the distance between the spin torque oscillator is simply different while the metallic spacer is the same one. But this will definitely modulate the type of coupling that is mediated between the two. And I'm assuming here that I have some RKK-Y-like coupling between the spin torque oscillators. We also accounted for some other, the inclusion of other type of couplings, but I will eventually discuss them later. So if some of you is familiar with topological model, you might have already guessed that this model can be mapped into the SSH model. So in the SSH model, originally the A and B were two different molecules. Now for me are two different spin torque oscillators, and I will show you in a second what's the difference between them. And these bonds, the intracell and intercell coupling, in our case, are mediated by some metallic spacers between the spin torque oscillators. So now let me do something more, and that's the last thing that I will do in terms of building up the complexity of this system. So let me take this system, which now I really represent as an SSH chain, and let me take the A sites. So I can control the spin current, and I want to assume that I can control the spin current in each single spin torque oscillator. So what I'm going to do in the A sites is to inject this amount of spin current. So you might notice that the spin current, it's really double the amount of the damping that the oscillator is subjected to. So ultimately, what's happening physically is that you inject a spin current which overcomes the damping in the oscillator. So you would expect the oscillator to precess at the FMR frequency. And this type of term makes the non-Hermitian part of the Hamiltonian the one that I'm showing you. So this will be written in the following way. So you can see that there is a plus sign which expresses gain in this spin torque oscillator site, while instead for the B sites, I'm just not going to do anything. I'm just not going to inject any spin current at all. So when I'm looking at the Hamiltonian in these B sites, what I'm seeing is as a function of these new B operators that I somehow artificially introduced, but I can definitely do so, I'm going to see that there is loss. And more specifically, there is really a balanced gain versus loss. So there is as much gain at the A sites as loss at the B sites. And this type of model, it's quite well known by now in the context of non-Hermitian topology, and it's called the PT-symmetric SSH model. So then what I want to understand next is the following. So I want to look at the system and the Hamiltonian that I derived, assuming to have a certain number of spin torque oscillators in which I inject the spin current as I just described. And I want to diagonalize this Hamiltonian with open boundary condition. So this will tell me, and this is what people normally do when looking at topological systems. This will tell me if I have edge states in my system. But then what about the topological nature of these edge states? So to understand something about the topology of edge states, we need instead to set a periodic boundary condition in a system and understand if there is a topological invariant that can tell us what's the topological nature of these edge states, if it's trivial or not. So that's what we started doing. We imagine that now our array of spin torque oscillator closes up in a loop, and we can rewrite the Hamiltonian in this very simple form. It's a two-band model where the two bands really corresponds to the A and B sides. Now there is a new issue in the context of non-Hermitian system. So when you start accounting for dissipation and you still want to characterize topologically a system, you will have to start asking yourself if the bulk edge correspondence holds. So in other terms, if I can derive a topological invariant using periodic boundary condition, does that topological invariant really tells me something about the edge states? And it turns out that sometimes in non-Hermitian systems, there are really exotic phenomena that occur that you will never find in an Hermitian system. These phenomena are usually, they do usually not guarantee the bulk edge correspondence, and they're called, they all go under the name of non-Hermitian skin effect. So what you observe when this non-Hermitian skin effect is present is that the open boundary condition spectra and the periodic boundary condition spectra are really different. So even if you just add one site to close the boundaries, you will observe a different spectrum. And in general, the bulk states that you will expect to just be spread through the bulk somehow localize at one edge. And even more exotically, if you close the boundary and you make them periodic, an imaginary magnetic flux seems to be enclosed by this type of system. Now, we wanted to first verify if this is the scenario in which we are working on, or if we still can think that our system has a bulk edge correspondence. So in general, a way to do this, no matter which Hamiltonian you have at ends, is to understand what's the gap of the system. So when we are dealing with the Hermitian Hamiltonian, we just have real energies. So we can really project them on one axis, and the gap can be represented at some point in the axis. So the gap that corresponds to the energies that are forbidden in the system. But instead, when we have non-Hermitian systems, in general, our eigenvalues can have two types, can have both a real part of the energy and an imaginary part of the energy. So when you want to draw the energies, you will have to use the complex plane. And in this case, you can have two different types of gaps. One that is called the point gap, meaning that there is really a point in the complex plane that corresponds to forbidden energies for the system. It's a gap. Or you can have a line gap. So there is a full line in the plane in which there could be no states whatsoever. And generally, when you have a line gap, the bulk edge correspondence holds. So we know that for our specific system and also all the different variations that we look at, we have some special symmetries that guarantee the existence of a line gap. And we can also directly look at our Hamiltonian and find out that we have a line gap with some analysis. So in this case, we have something that is called parity times symmetry, and we know that the bulk edge correspondence holds. And we also found that a line gap is present. So now, if I'm going to observe edge modes, I know that I can theoretically look instead at the system with periodic boundary condition and find the topological invariant that captures the nature of these modes. So that's what we proceeded to do. We look at the Hamiltonian, but with open boundary condition, and we diagonalize the system. So that's what we find. That's what we find in the PT symmetric case. So maybe this looks quite complex, and I don't think I have a cursor in this moment, but in the case of the real energy, the part that it's really, I would say, more essential to focus on is really at the center of this of the spectrum. So you can see that there is a gap. So the bulk edge modes are gapped, but there are two modes with the zero real energy, with respect to the FMR frequency, that live in the gap. So there are two edge modes. Now, these edge modes, in theory, can also have imaginary energy because the Hamiltonian is non-Hermitian. And what we find looking at the other spectrum, the one corresponding to the imaginary energy, is that the bulk modes they don't have imaginary energy, so they are purely real. But instead, you can see that the modes that corresponds to the edge modes have a finite imaginary energy. So specifically, we find two topological edge states that have a real part of the energy corresponding to the FMR frequency and an imaginary part of the energy that is Lezin or lossy, depending on the edge modes that you are looking at. So now can we describe, can we try to capture their topological nature? So there is an invariant specifically for this case that can be defined. It's called global vary phase. It's very similar to the vary phase that you encounter in conventional non-Hermitian topology. I would say that the only difference is that it's not a property anymore of a band. As you can see, I'm summing over the two bands. And also my Hamiltonian is non-Hermitian, so I have to start distinguishing between the eigenvectors that diagonalize H and the eigenvectors that diagonalize H dagger. Anyways, this, from a physical point of view, this topological invariant is quantifying the number of pairs of gapless real energy edge states that I have in the system. And we find that in our system, when we modulate appropriately the relative strength of the coupling that is mediated by the metallic spacer, the global Berry phase is different from 0. And it corresponds to 1, meaning that we have a couple of topological edge states. And we can both have a ferromagnetic or antiferromagnetic alignment. So let me focus on an antiferromagnetic alignment just for simplicity and show you the full phase diagram of this system. So here you can see that there are 2 topological phases below, one in which the global Berry phase is 1 and one in which the global Berry phase is 0. And then there is another distinction between what I call broken and unbroken phases. So here, for example, it's true, you still have some edge modes, but it turns out that in this part of the phase diagram, your edge modes are degenerate with the bulk modes. So the effects that you might want to look at are going to be definitely less strong because the edge modes can possibly scatter. So I will focus for now on this unbroken phase, where I know that I can have topological edge states, and these topological edge states are perfectly isolated in a gap for what concerns their real energy. So I would say that up to now, what I really been discussing, it's an Hamiltonian associated with magnons and the possibility of finding some edge states. But I feel that maybe from a physical point of view, it's not really clear which type of consequences we are going to have. So in order to show you this, I will show you some magnetization simulation that we performed. So we went back to the LLG equation, the nonlinear ones, and we simulated the dynamics of 20 couple spin torque oscillators. And we used this parametrization, so as a function of the power, so the experimental micropower, and also as a function of the precession angle of the magnetization in the plane. And we perform these simulations at room temperature. So we start from linear conditions that are consistent with how we derived our Hamiltonian. And I'm now going to focus on this part. But first of all, what are really our expectations from a classical point of view? So I have 20 spin torque oscillators, and I know that in each odd sites, I'm injecting a certain spin current, while in the others, I'm not injecting anything. So from a classical point of view, what I would expect to observe is that all these spin torque oscillators where the spin current is injected start precessing. But instead, what we observe when we know exactly where to look at, because we did all this Hamiltonian and topological analysis, is the following. So what we observe in the simulation is that the bulk is non-active, at least for long times. Of course, when you start running the simulation for very long times, non-linear effects will come into play, and they will be detrimental to our Hamiltonian description. But on relatively long times, what we observe is that there is just one lasing spin torque oscillator at the edge. So you're pumping spin current in all the spin torque oscillator, but the only one that will start precessing is the one at the edge. And which one of the two? Since I said that we have 2 topological edge states. We have one with an imaginary positive energy and one with a negative imaginary energy. So the one that will start oscillating will be the one with this imaginary component of the energy, which is positive, and really signals somehow a predisposition for this site to grow a higher density of magnons. Now, when we start moving away from this phase that we found, what we observe instead, let's say that we are not moving too far away, so maybe we are still in the broken but topological phase. What we observe is that maybe the spin torque oscillator at the edge will be the first one that starts precessing and reaches its equilibrium power. But then after a while, all the other spin torque oscillator in which we are injecting spin current start precessing as well. And of course, if you really move away from this unbroken topological phase, you will just see that all the spin torque oscillator very quickly start precessing and reach the equilibrium power. So what I want to somehow stress is that this is really a result that comes out from our semi-classical magnetization simulation. But it's a result that we could never really find. It's a type of effect that we could never really find if we would not know where to look at. So in which type of regime and phase we should look at. So now, just as a conclusion, well, we definitely found, just concerning this single project, that, for example, the microwave emission in a spin torque oscillators array can be topological if parameters are tuned appropriately. So this could have already some interesting application if, of course, people would be able to properly measure it. There is definitely in other possibilities in this system, so different things that we can play with in terms of increasing dimensionality or tuning couplings and so on. But I think for me, at least, the most important take-home message from this project is that this was really just the first application of non-Hermitian topology to a magnetic systems. And that in general, we know that magnons are dissipative, so we should not always ignore this fact. And also because it turns out, at least by looking at the results of our work, that sometimes dissipation is really not as detrimental as we think, but it can also lead to, for example, new phenomena that we could never observe without taking it into account. So yeah, with this is the conclusion.
Thank you very much, Benedetta, for this fascinating talk. By the way, please note, Zoom has a feature to thank the speaker. There's a clap icon.
Ah, okay, nobody's.
And feel free to press that right now. So the talk is open for questions. To ask a question, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and I will call upon you in order. There's no need to wait for a previous question to be answered. If you have a question, just raise your hand and wait for us to get to you. So while people are thinking about questions, let me ask, what do you think is the most interesting and promising practical application of these results?
Of the specific results?
Well, the approach of using the array of spin torque oscillators.
Yeah. So yeah, really specifically to this project. So I would say, for what I know, these spin torque systems, and especially an array of them, have been proposed in different Spintronics neural networks application. So maybe the possibility of, sending signals and information by being able to switch and tune where geometrically the emission is coming from could be definitely an interesting application, or also for creating, grading, say, like spin wave guides. So by using these effects and then the robustness of these effects, for example, it could be possible to send the spin waves through regions that have different magnetic dissipations if everything would be incorporated together.
I see. Okay, we have a question from Justin Hu. Please go ahead. Justin Hu, 0129.
Hear me?
Yeah,
yes.
not so loud.
A little louder, but we can hear you.
Okay, I will speak louder like this.
Yeah.
Okay. I have two questions.
Yeah.
Well, my first question is that in your first part of the analysis, it's a linearized version of the LLG equation. So it's
yes.
a linear Hamiltonian, and at the magnetic simulation is intrinsically nonlinear. So right. My first question is, did you observe some discrepancies after nonlinear effect is taken account? And so this brings to me my second question. Yeah. So my second question is that recently there are a lot of theory about this kind of non-Hermitian physics. So is there some theoretical proposals about how the nonlinearity can play a role in non-Hermitian systems? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the questions. So for your first question, yeah, definitely we started observing discrepancies, right, in these magnetic simulations, in the sense that, I mean, it all, of course, depends on the parameters that you're using. But anyways, after a while, so if you start running this for, it could be an hour, honestly, it could be 10 minutes. It really depends on the parameters that you're using. But if you start running this long enough, of course, you know, because of the coupling between different spins, nonlinear effects will start playing a role. And then you observe, for example, bulk modes that start lasing, even if you are very close to the unbroken topological phase. It would be really interesting to understand, you know, how these timescales can be related to the ones that one can observe in an experiment. So there were definitely discrepancies. And concerning in general non-Hermitian systems and non-linearities in non-Hermitian systems, no, I have not observed, so maybe this is also a limitation of my knowledge, but going through literature, I have not yet seen a system in which non-linearities are taken into account. And indeed, one comment, one referee that we added was that this type of systems and our system are actually really interested, because one can start looking at also how physically non-linearities come into play.
Thank you. Thank you.
Professor Blugel.
Good evening. Very nice talk. I really enjoyed it very much. I have one question to your analysis of the topological invariance. I think you went to the complex plane. And in the complex plane, you focus basically on the line separated ones. On the left hand of the transparency, you have also ones which probably are related to holonomic functions. Maybe I wasn't quite sure, but maybe you didn't focus on them. Is there some additional physics in there?
Yeah, right. So we focused on this, like our system as a line gap. So we definitely just look at this type of systems, and then in terms of topological invariant, for this PT symmetric case, which is quite well known, you know, we looked at a global Berry phase. So what we did was to diagonalize the right and left eigenvectors.
Right.
So for what concerns the point gap, so there is a lot of new research done in this direction. So these point gaps seem to be associated, seem to have a topology somehow of their own. And they are associated with these skin effects that you can observe in non-Hermitian physics. Now we didn't focus on this in 1D, just because in 1D, ultimately the skin effects are quite trivial from a physical point of view, in the sense that all the systems that I personally observe in which they see skin effects in 1D, they create an asymmetric coupling between, you know, the right and left direction. So then, of course, you will see that all the bulk modes are localizing at the edge or not the other, but just really because you're choosing a preferential direction. So from a physical point of view, at least in 1D, it's not very interesting. But yeah, mathematically, I know that there is quite some research on these point gaps. You can still define topological invariants associated with them, though.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Silva, please. You can ask the next question.
Okay, yeah, you guys can hear me then?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, very nice talk, thank you. Trying to bring things back to sort of more traditional magnonic, or at least what I'm used to dealing with. So we have this situation where if you have a thin film and a wave number is variable relative to the direction of magnetization, when the magnetization is in plane, you can get these things called Damon-Eschbach modes, right? And,
right.
And these are surface confined modes that decay exponentially into the bulk with a decay constant that scales as the wave number along the surface. So I'm just trying to figure out, so is there, in your language here that you're presenting, which is sort of the language that is very currently of great interest with understanding these, is there some correspondence between Damon-Eschbach modes and what you've brought up here, or are those just considered some sort of trivial case that doesn't even apply whatsoever? Because they are surface confined, and it's a very generalized result, and there's chirality associated with them too. So help me out, that'd be great.
Yeah, that would be no, that would be definitely really interesting. So let me know if I'm like answering properly your question, but I would definitely think that you could treat these modes as in the way in which we are looking at, and as well as you could actually treat in general magnetic modes. So any type of mode that is subjected to, you know, a decay can be treated with these techniques. And probably the Damon-Eschbach mode will have a slightly different decay than, you know, usual thermal magnons in some high energy regime in a ferromagnet. That said, so that is definitely something that can be done. I would say that the issue here with the thin film, it's the following one. So our system, it's quite nice, right? Because we can imagine that we can control each side with some uniform magnetization in a separate way. And then, you know, the Hamiltonian becomes quite easy, and we could do all the analysis that I've shown. Now, I started thinking about thin films. But I think what makes sense is really thinking about something that can be done experimentally. And in thin films, it's very difficult to control, you know, different sides. So you will have also to establish, and that's quite some work, a theory that capture the injection, for example, of spin current at the boundaries. And now this really gets smeared in the bulk material. So then you would be able to do something interesting in the terms of, you know, modulating gain and loss and see something. But it's technically much more difficult.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions? Okay, if not, let's thank the speaker again by pressing the clap button.